Good afternoon and welcome back to another ironic introduction to another video. Today I finally updated my spreadsheet for the best champions Suicide Mastery compatible. I put the air quotes there because I think it's more accurate to call them attrition masteries. I'll be calling them that throughout the rest of the video, but that's a rant and a debate for another time. For now, just deal with me since you're here to listen. That said, I'll have a timestamp for the 4 columns, the poison, immune / mitigation, both poison and bleed immune / mitigation, bleed immune / mitigation, and the honorable mentions for the tier list as a whole, as well as a timestamp where I kind of go over the math behind the masteries of like how much damage you're taking, how you mitigate it with recovery and willpower and coagulate, and kind of the value and net gain for why I land at my 1.1 point or 3 points 1 point methodology. Cross that bridge later. But for now, I want to go through the spreadsheet, just like the key parts of it, because a lot of these champions have bolded letters next to them. So if a champion has a W next to them, it means that they heal with willpower. If they have a C next to them, it means there is conditional immunity. If they have a B, it means compelling reason to run both masteries. If there is an A, it means they have additional benefits. If there is a D, it means they are better as a defender than they are as an attacker. If there is an R, there is a recoil mitigation value there. If there is an N, then they are recoil nullification, i.e. they completely nullify recoil entirely. And if there is an S, that means this champion is penalized by recoil, typically with some kind of SP1 or SP2 spam in the champion's kit that you want to access, that recoil is really heavily punishing you for. If the champion is highlighted in green, it means I think they are considered a high value rank up, especially if you're trying to build a roster around this. And if they are yellow, it means that I think they are conditionally worth ranking up. Kind of depends on where your roster is, what you're trying to do. And white is like desperation levels. Not necessarily a bad rank up, just means that you probably didn't have anyone in yellow or green. Now that said, being an endgame player, when I first started off, I really felt that these masteries were something I could take really far in the game without ever having to turn them off. And I got pretty far. I got pretty deep. I did my whole Act 6 completion run with these masteries on. I never turned them off, but there are a few instances in the game where I've had to turn them off. Act 5 Exploration, there was a rage path on several of the Act, I believe 5.3 or 5.4 paths, I don't remember which, but the rage paths, I turned them off because the extra damage was triggering rage way too often, and it was more of a headache than it was worth, and I didn't have Clairvoyant at the time, so it just wasn't worth the extra headache to me, especially since I was mostly using like Ghost Rider to force my exploration on that. Additionally, there are paths in Act 6, 6.2, 6.3, 6.4, where I just want to have access to a champion who is a special 1 spam, or maybe they're not attrition mastery friendly, they're just constantly bleeding out, and that just doesn't work in my advantage. So in those situations, I essentially map those paths out ahead of time, and then I plan on running them all simultaneously, turning the masteries off and then rushing through them. And then finally, I think that Labyrinth of Legends is something you can push through with these masteries and do very well with, especially with Aegon. But Abyss of Legends was like the first real content where I was like, nope, gotta turn them off. It was just so incredibly painful having them on for a lot of the fights where I either was using a non-friendly champion and I just couldn't mitigate it with SP3s, or I wanted to be spamming SP1 and SP2 and the fights were so long I was just taking an insane amount of recoil damage. Especially even champions that are like really friendly with attrition masteries, like Aegon, who can be a special 3 rotation. I really wanted to do my special 2 rotation, and so I felt the pain a lot there as well. So if you're looking at these masteries, my biggest tip is don't get them if you're not concerned either with like things like the Summoner Showdown, where it's been shown that these masteries were really important, or if you're not interested in arena grinding, because honestly I think the highest value in these masteries is arena grinding. There is a couple champions here who really benefit from them, but overall I'd say as a player it hurts you more than it helps you to run these masteries unless you run arena, because the quantity of time and the amount of extra fights and a little bit of extra points here and there, it really adds up, especially over a long period of time. So if you're not committed to that arena grind, that grind mentality, I would suggest maybe you evaluate other options, or maybe you are, fleshing out your roster and you want to have access to these masteries so you can use champions like Omega Red to push War. That's a whole different kind of explanation along itself. So that said, I'll finally dive into the spreadsheet, starting off with Captain Marvel in the Poison Immune. Captain Marvel is Poison Immune, but you're going to want to run both because she does shrug debuffs in general, all damage over time effects, when she triggers binary above 20. Additionally, she ends the fights incredibly quickly, and if you have her awakened, she becomes indestructible if you trigger binary over 20. Actually, she might shrug the debuffs just in general when you trigger binary. I don't remember, and I'm not going to look it up at this point. But anyways, she goes indestructible if you trigger binary above 20. And if you run Nick Fury, which you really want to run with Captain Marvel movie, you can just tack on Deadpool X-Force or one of the Deadpools, like Deadpool Red, in order to get a free heal, and it gives you a lot of really good sustain in the fight, and allows you to just kind of use Captain Marvel movie as a taxi through an entire lane without using any potions. It also gives you access to kind of like a cheeky timeout method in Alliance Quest. If you have the her awakened plus Nick Fury plus a Deadpool, you can trigger the heal, use that to go indestructible, use however long your indestructible phase is to get your damage in, and then time out if you need to. Do be mindful that they are probably going to change the timeout, but until they do, you can take advantage of that as well. And then finally, while invulnerable from her awakened ability, she does completely mitigate recoil damage. So that's something to keep in mind. Next up is Medusa. Medusa, if you're using her, you're probably using her to counter a robot or maybe one of the nasty Ultrons in variant 1. In which case, I would really recommend you just launch an SP1, eat the recoil damage at the start, and then build up to SP3s in order to continue the rotation. And it's really important to keep in mind that once you've armor shattered a robot, they can't gain power, and their abilities are shut off. So you can just heavy corner spam them until you're up to a special 3, launch the special 3 to re-trigger your armor shattered, and then go back into an armor heavy corner strategy again all over again. It's incredibly consistent, it's really easy to do, and there's a lot of value for that as long as there are robots to armor shatter, although this is becoming less valuable as they're, Kabam knows the cheesy method of Medusa and are building workarounds for it. Next up is Hyperion. You lose out on Hyperion's SP1 and SP2 spam, which is arguably like the best part of his kit, but he is poison immune. You can drop an SP3 to start, and his high damage output does mean that the fight is going to end relatively quickly. He has access to a heal, but the long duration of the heal, meaning it's like not like a lot of healing, but it's a long heal, as well as the long time it takes to activate the heal, makes it kind of dangerous to utilize in the first place, and you are sacrificing part of your power gain, which is part of his core kit. So I don't feel like you're getting the full value of Hyperion, and his damage is already good without the masteries, but if you are going to use him and you already have him ranked up, he does have some value with the masteries. At the very least, the poison, but it's mostly the recoil that really hurts Hyperion. It's not so much the bleed. Next up is She-Hulk. Now, She-Hulk is cool because a lot of her damage comes from her basic attacks. Now, she does have access to a faster ramp up with SP1 and some really nice utility on the SP2, but you could play She-Hulk without ever launching an attack, a special attack, meaning that you don't really have to worry about recoil and you get access to this like perma or pseudo perma taunt champion. Very, very valuable in the game. Additionally, if you're fighting a science champion, there is a percentage chance if she's awakened to shrug debuffs. So you could potentially shrug the bleed debuff if you're running both masteries a little bit faster. But mostly, it's just a lot of basic attack damage from She-Hulk, which is really, really nice to have. Next up is Hulk Ragnarok. Now, Hulk Ragnarok is only poison immune, but if he's awakened, he does have access to up to 30% healing every single fight when either Hulk or his opponent goes 20% or lower. Now, it is a coin flip, and it's not going to happen every time, but given the fact that with like the proper mastery setup, you're only losing like 10 to 7% of your health to double edge if you're running both masteries, you are going to heal more than you take damage kind of in the long run. So as long as you play well, this does have a really good healing taxi champion. You do kind of hurt from the SP1 heal block for Gulk, but he's generally speaking a SP2 champion, or you could even run an SP3 champ rotation to mitigate recoil even further for Gladiator Hulk. Next up is Red Hulk. Red Hulk is already poison immune. The poison is automatically removed and has a chance to convert into a heat charge, meaning that you do have a potential at the start of a fight to access slightly ramped up damage. You do need a lot of heat charges on Red Hulk in general to see that proper ramp up, but it does help just a bit. Next up is Mysterio. He's very reliant on his poison damage, and he wants to spam Special 3, which means that you don't really have to worry about recoil. The only thing to note here is that his Special 2 does give him access to Power Drain, so the recoil comes into play there. He's not a full Special 3 champion. Additionally, he is one of the champions who has access to a passive heal block. I do feel it's a very underutilized or underappreciated utility, because it does bypass things like Selective Lifestream, which is the variant 3 Kang node where he heals up if he's not shocked or incinerate. Mysterio can work around that with a passive heal block, and you can keep that up pretty much permanently. Next up is Mephisto. Mephisto is generally accepted as better as a defender, but if you're early on in your roster for Alliance Quest, especially if you're running half attritions, he does counter many champions, has decent utilities in his immunity, and he offers a safety net, which is really, really nice, especially for new or developing rosters. And he does have a guaranteed amount of sustain/healing that you can ramp up over the course of the quest, so that's nice to know, especially in the future. Next up is Diablo, who has 35% reduced poison damage, or 0.015% healing from willpower 1 point. Additionally, when he's poisoned, you do gain 20% power rate and 450 attack. So if you do have Liquid Courage active, you get that permanently. So that's kind of a nice little gain. Not a ton of healing over time, but it's better than taking damage. Next up is Man-Thing. A lot of his damage comes from being able to spam Special 1. So having recoil active really negatively impacts his ability to dish out the damage, and he does have some form of recoil mitigation when he's awakened, but it's really not that great because it's such a long duration heal that you're probably going to launch another special before it already happens, especially with Mystic Dispersion, but he's better as a defender anyways. Not really the world's greatest attacker, although there is definitely value for him as an attacker. Next up is Ronan. Now Ronan is poison immune, so that's neat, but he is usually used to stun lock an opponent, which means you're launching Special 1, Special 1, Special 1, lots of recoil damage. Next up is Hulk. Same thing as Ronan, except Hulk's stun lock is not as consistent, but that stun lock does trigger on all specials, so you really don't want to have recoil when you're spamming SP1 on the opponent in the corner, even though he is poison immune. Switching over to the next column, I have first up Omega Red. Now Omega Red, you really want to be running both. There's really no reason not to, because he is 90% damage reduction for bleeds, meaning that if you take 1 point and coagulate, you're actually healing for the entire fight. Additionally, while you have that free 16-second bleed on, he has his death field active the entire time, really giving you access to a lot of short-term burst damage, high spore counts at the start of the fight, and a lot of really good value from Omega Red. If you're going to use Omega Red, more important than his awakened ability, I would say, is actually running Double Edge specifically, but you might as well run both masteries at that point. Next up is Ghost. Now Ghost, when she phases, she removes all damage over time debuffs on her, and she gains a Fury buff in return. If she's awakened, this starts at the start of the fight for both of these masteries as well, and if you have the Hood synergy, after a Special 2, if you time the phase to the recoil, you will actually mitigate recoil completely. Very nice. Not as hard once you get it down. It takes a couple times to get down, but once you've got it, it's really easy to do very consistently. And some Ghost players even run 3 points in recoil, knowing that they can just mitigate the entirety of that damage. And it really helps her overall damage output from those big crits that she has. Next up is Namor. Once awakened and max Sig specifically, specifically, he takes less damage from attritions than he heals. Additionally, the damage from those masteries is actually returned to the opponent, so it's just free damage while you're hitting into them. Additionally, he does regenerate a little bit of his missing health from his special usage. This will help mitigate overall the damage you're taking and part of the recoil damage. And his playstyle, it involves a lot of special 3 spam into special 2 rotation and then fights over. So when you're using Namor, you don't have to worry too much about recoil. Just kind of something to note, when people talk about Namor, if you ever hear mention of Namor having really high regenerative capabilities, it's not his ability to heal on special. The missing percentage health heal on special is actually really minor. It's willpower plus reflecting the damage from both of these attrition masteries onto the opponent, and then just getting the heal for free. And it gives you a ton of healing over time, especially if you're really good at doing slow combos and intercepts and just really dragging it out. You can get a lot of healing over time, especially in longer fights. Next up is Clairvoyant. Now, she does get her immunities by changing stances, but she starts off bleed immune, so that's the most painful one. So you're really not going to take a lot of damage by the time you switch into the poison immune phase. Additionally, she lifesteals on special 2 when she's in the bleed phase, based on the damage she deals. So having these masteries actives mean you get a larger heal. You will take 5% recoil damage, but you're getting way more than that in the form of damage you're dealing, so it really pays off as long as you're comfortable sitting at 95% instead of 100. Next up is Warlock. He does have the potential to heal 4% per infection on a special 3. Recoil does punish his SP1 spam, which is one of his access to power drains or relatively consistent power drains. But honestly, in his best matchups, you don't use his SP1 very often. You're usually using his SP2 or his SP3. And increased damage really helps shore up what is arguably his only real weakness, which is relatively subpar damage. It's not bad damage, it's just a little less than, you know, your other crazy god tier champions like Cap Infinity War or Domino. Next up is Guillotine 2099. Now, you could play her as an SP3 only champion, or a champion that you never throw specials besides the one that you use to end the fight. But once ramped up, she does mitigate some of the chip damage by healing off of medium attacks. And this does mitigate recoil a bit, but if you're spamming SP2 and healing off the mediums, you're actually still going to take more damage than you heal. It's only a bit of mitigation, but it's not that bad. It does also mean that you're getting punished from the SP1 power drain, but because the power drain doesn't power lock or anything like that, it's really only good for like trying to prevent the opponent from throwing an SP3 in a power gain scenario, so it's really not ideal and can be overlooked as a negative anyways. I think for the most part, you're probably better off running Guillotine 2099 with attritions than you are running her without. Next up is Emma Frost. Now, Emma Frost has conditional immunities in the form of these masteries, as long as you're not starting the fight armor broken, but in the form of these masteries, you will shrug them off at the start of the fight and you don't have to worry about them. The only thing you have to worry about is recoil. It's just important to know that her immunity is dependent on being in diamond form. So if you're bringing her into like a biohazard or something, and you switch into telepath form, the instant you do that, you do become susceptible to these debuffs. Keep that in mind if you're using her for that kind of situation. Next up is Aegon. At a combo of 5, Aegon has a 40% chance on crit to shrug any debuff every time he crits. At a combo of 100, this becomes a 100% chance to shrug debuffs on crit. Because Aegon's like strongest value is his ability to do really long quest chains like Realm of Legends, Labyrinth of Legends, or Abyss of Legends, I'd say that the initial damage loss, which is actually very minimal and maybe costs you a potion or 2, is really worth the massive damage increase, especially given that Aegon can be a special 3 only champion with a crazy long stun, or honestly just never throw specials and just pummel the opponent down without relying on your specials for big damage, just because he hits super hard. The only thing I will mention here is that recoil really hurts your SP2 rotation with Aegon, which is how you get a really big bleed, especially if you're doing the heavy method where you heavy and then SP2. And for things like Abyss of Legends specifically, I really use this a lot, to the point where I actually turned the masteries off because I found I was getting more damage value just off of the heavy special 2 rotation than I was from having the base damage increase from the masteries. So something to keep in mind, especially if you're trying to conserve potions. Next up is Iceman. Now Iceman, he gets a lot of value from throwing a lot of SP1s. It is a lot, you know, if you're running Despair, it's kind of his way to sort of mitigate healing, potentially prevent healing altogether. You don't really want to launch the SP2 too often, especially for max damage, so there's just a lot of recoil punishment. You can still use him as a general immunities with these masteries. I just think he's better without, but he's still good with them. It's just kind of one of those scenarios where despite being immune, I think he's better without the masteries. But still good with, so he does get that green tick mark just because of his broad immunities. Next up is Darkhawk. Now, when you alternate between modes, this allows for a regeneration that is equivalent to the 1 point recoil damage, which means that after your first recoil, there is no further recoil penalization. But you can actually mitigate all of the recoils as long as you have like proper synergies with Darkhawk, so that you're starting in a phase and then you are constantly switching. But if you're not running any synergies, it's 1 punishment from recoil and then the rest are free. Next up is Dr. Voodoo. He heals 12% of his health at the start of every fight, or 8.4% when you have poison over 10 seconds, and this helps really mitigate the attrition masteries. Additionally, depending on his awakened ability, you can get a longer heal, kind of depends on how you take it, but I would say because of the long duration of the heal, you really don't have to worry about the masteries. It's really nice to have on Dr. Voodoo. The biggest issue here is if you're special 1 spamming with him, recoil is going to catch up with you quicker than you think. You know, I should probably put an S here. Let's throw that in. Next up is Ronin. Now, Ronin has the ability to shrug damage over time, or debuffs in general, and if you do it very quickly, you can actually shrug the debuffs and only take like 4 to 5% of your health at the start of the fight, which is really good, especially since a lot of his damage comes from space hits. He does have access to a special 3 rotation, but honestly, like his overall damage output is way higher with them than it is without, and you don't really need to be doing the SP1, SP2 anyways. It's just that Ronin as a champion, even with the masteries, he doesn't hit too hard, or hard enough, honestly, to be worth noting, but he's still fun to play. He does have relevant utility in some scenarios, and overall good damage. Just not like the world's best champion, but definitely worth noting as far as pseudo immunities. Next up are both the Visions, Vision Age of Ultron and just regular or original Vision. They're both double immune because they are robots, but because they have the whole power control mechanic with SP1 and SP2 and power gain mechanics, either from stealing power or synthesis of power, you really don't want to have recoil on. It really hurts because you're dropping so many SP2s very frequently. I do use OG Vision a lot, and I just mitigate the recoil either by only launching SP2s when I absolutely need to and throwing in SP3s to help mitigate that damage, and then just regular baiting specials. It's not ideal, and I am losing some of my utility, but it does allow me to get access to that utility that Vision has, especially in synergies, and is still very potent. Next up is Sentinel. He does have a special 1 SP2 spam desire, so despite being double immune, it really hurts. Next up is Dragon Man, new champion here. He does launch SP3s to start the fight, just kind of ramping himself up. So depending on the length of the fight, recoil might not be too big of a deal, but recoil does mean you lose or are punished for accessing that slow on his SP1 or the damage rotation on his SP2 where you're launching multiple SP2s back to back. It is a lot of recoil damage, but it is also a lot of damage in return. So a little bit of hit or miss, standard attrition warfare. Nebula is kind of a lot of effort and a lot of skill, but there's a lot of potential there as well. Use at your own risk. Next is Blade. Blade has conditional immunity because he shrugs debuffs off faster based on his power meter. This doesn't really apply a lot to the double edge, but it does mean your double edge bleed will be less than 16 seconds. It's just still a very long bleed anyways. But the main thing here is that once awakened, he does have access to regenerative capabilities. And at a decent sig, he actually heals very quickly and can really, really mitigate the recoil. He can mitigate the bleed and the poison, but the poison does reduce the healing factor. Keep that in mind. And it's worth noting that if you're trying to use Blade for utility purposes or taxi purposes, it's frustrating, but still doable. Not my first recommendation, but definitely worth noting. Next up is Mr. Sinister. His anti-crit mechanic is really best for war defense. He's honestly just way better as a defender than he's in as an attacker, but his SP1 does transfer attrition masteries, which is kind of a cheeky way to get a pretty good amount of damage as an attacker, or if you're using him in arena. Additionally, you can defeat science champions with him to stack up the amount of he heals, but from poison. But it's just not a practical use case. Not a lot of scenarios where it really comes up. Next up is Dormammu. It's a really nice damage boost to Dorm. His special 3 does give a really good heal, giving him good access to recoil mitigation. Overall, he's a really good power control champion. It's just that his special 1 is how he deals with buffs. So the recoil punishment there takes away a lot of the utility. Next up is Invisible Woman. When her force field is active, she heals from attritions. And actually, after the first force field, you could potentially keep it up for the rest of the fight on the second one and just have a perma heal, but there's a really high skill floor on Invisible Woman, and I just don't know if the payoff is really worth it, and her damage output is already really high even without these masteries if you're playing her optimally to begin with, which is again arguably less worth it than Nebula. Like, Nebula has a high skill floor, but at least that high skill floor comes with a lot of gain. Invisible Woman, kind of hit or miss. Next up is both the Ultrons. They're double immune because they're robots. And then finally, Mole Man will shrug both of the debuffs at the start of a fight to generate monster mass, which is nice if you're trying to activate Frenzy faster as an attacker. But if you're trying to use him as a defender, it's actually worse, because I do find that Mole Man as a defender is more frustrating before he triggers Frenzy, because that's when he shrugs debuffs, including stuns, as well as goes unstoppable when you hit into his block. When he's frenzied, you can reliably stun him to get your damage window, so giving him monster masses at the start of the fight just makes this easier for the attacker to do. But as an attacker, using Mole Man as an attacker, it does mean faster damage ramp up, it does mean overall higher damage, but you do want to use an SP1 once you trigger Frenzy to drop a shock on the opponent in order to get access to higher damage output for that extra burst, which does mean you're going to be suffering from recoil as well. But it's a pretty good payoff. It's just that even with these masteries, Mole Man's damage is pretty subpar. Next up is Karnak. His awakened ability means he shrugs debuffs off faster. Additionally, he has a far reduced damage duration on double edge and 65% reduced poison damage, meaning he actually heals from willpower once you shrug off the double edge. Again, kind of the issue here with Karnak is his overall lack of value. Partially in his damage, partially in his consistency and utility. Both of those leave a lot to be desired, but, you know, desperation, or maybe you really, really like Karnak, could bring you here. Next is King Groot. King Groot arguably could be placed in the yellow depending on how much you really like King Groot. I'm not doing him full justice by keeping him here in the white, but his damage is just so bad that if you're ranking him up, I want you to do it because you know the value of King Groot, not because I put him in yellow. But he is bleed immune, and he does shrug off debuffs at the cost of a Fury, which means he does shrug stuns off as well, making him typically a better defender than he is as an attacker, but his insane sustain potential is what makes him a good attacker. So if you're using him for that purpose, you can get a lot of value there. Next up is Crossbones, who when awakened has a 15 to 25% chance to shrug debuffs, which is higher if you're facing against a science champion and lower percent chance if facing against a mutant, and this does include the attrition masteries as far as I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, feel free. Next up is Agent Venom, who has a chance to shrug off debuffs, and Kingpin, who has a chance to shrug off debuffs. Both of those champions leave a lot to be desired, so even with shrugging off these debuffs, they're just not quite there yet. Brief moment. Sorry guys, it's a long video, so I am going to take a drink. So bear with me, and I'll stick the timestamp here. Anyways, Finally, or next up, is the bleed category. First up is Corvus Glaive. Now, Corvus Glaive does not take damage from bleed, cold snap, or shock when he has Glaive immunity, which should be the entire duration of the fight when you're using Corvus Glaive. And as a result, the debuffs are there, but they're actually causing you to heal from willpower. So having Double Edge active means that you actually start the fight off with a free heal. And even with Liquid Courage active and that reduced poison heal, you do still heal as long as you have the Double Edge, and willpower can mitigate most of the poison, so it's not that bad. As long as you don't get knocked down or run through all your glaive charges, do be mindful of that. The bleed immunity is, shoot, what is the word? It's conditional. Sorry, brain fart. But because he really wants to end fights very short, he wants to end them within those 20 glaive charges, you really want to run both masteries just to make sure you're getting the most damage out of them up front as fast as possible. Next up is Colossus, who after his rework, his insane damage and really good immunities with the bleed and the incinerate immunities means that he can really pummel opponents down and really run both of these masteries without worrying too much about the damage repercussions. Recoil does hurt a bit, but he has a relatively SP2 centric rotation, maybe even an SP3 then SP2 rotation, and very big damage, meaning that the fights end before the recoil really hurts you. Excuse me. Next up is Ghost Rider, which I might actually switch with Magneto, but that's down the line. This is less of a tier list and more of a spreadsheet. But Ghost Rider, his heavy attack gives him access to a wicked amount of lifesteal, and this is lifesteal per hit, so it's not reliant on his damage, but it does mean that the recoil damage you take from SP1 and SP2, as long as you were like relatively healthy when you started the fight, you can gain that all back with this really long, really big lifesteal per hit. And if you're talking about resource management, Ghost Rider is amazing for new and developing rosters as they push through Alliance Quest or maybe just questing in general. They just want a really big healer. Ghost Rider is a really good option for that. Next up is The Thing. Now, The Thing is one of the best defenders due to forcing specific mechanics from the player or specific counters, and you can comfortably special 3 with him as an attacker if you're trying to avoid recoil damage entirely, but also if he's awakened and high sig, you can mitigate some of the recoil damage either by using a heavy before special or dropping a heavy immediately after an SP2. You can trigger the protection fast enough. I will note that as a defender though, because Thing has just like so much tankiness and is often throwing a lot of specials at the opponent, having recoil active takes away a lot of his potential as a defender because it just shreds through his health very, very quickly for the attacking team. And that recoil really, really hurts there. Not all champions throw specials as frequently. Thing is just one who's souped up where you're constantly baiting specials, so recoil really, really comes into play. Next is Magneto Red, who is 90% bleed and shock resistant, so you do want that 1 point and coagulate for 100% resistance, and he is a special 3 powerhouse, meaning you don't really have to worry about recoil damage, and the damage numbers are nutty. So keep a good eye on Magneto Red if you're looking for bleed immune champions, and you can mitigate poison very, very easily. Next up is Apocalypse. Apocalypse, after 8 seconds of suffering from a bleed or incinerate, he will become immune to them for the rest of the quest, which means that, you know, you do have to suffer through essentially 5 to 6% of your health from Double Edge, depending on your mastery setup, with Apocalypse, but then you're bleed immune for the rest of the fight, and you can use him for any bleed node mechanic, etc., etc. My major thing with Apocalypse is if you're running these masteries, he does have a special 1 and special 2 rotation, meaning recoil is going to really, really, really hurt. And even if you mitigate this with like a special 3 first, you're still following it up with a special 1, special 2, and his damage numbers, they're not the world's greatest. They're not bad, but they're definitely low enough that you're going to be taking some recoil. So keep an eye out for that, but overall, decent enough bleed immune champion at least. Next up is Iron Man Infinity War. He's bleed immune so long as you have an armor up. You start with 1, so that means you don't have to worry about Double Edge. The major thing with Iron Man Infinity War is that his damage is low, and you use his SP1 and his SP2 to stack Plasma to get large amounts of damage over time on the opponent, meaning lots of recoil. Also, if you're using him as a defender, which he's arguably better as a defender than he's an attacker, I left it kind of ambiguous there. I don't want, to start a flame war over it. But arguably better as a defender, that recoil is going to kill you in the last 15% of the phase, and that really takes away Iron Man Infinity War's biggest threat, which is the last 15% special power gain, special spam, unblockable special, just annoying auto block champion there. Kind of having to deal with that mechanic. Next up is Morningstar. Now, you don't want to run Liquid Courage with Morningstar. You can, but it's going to complicate how you stack souls. It's still doable, it's just not as straightforward because the poison damage is going to cause your soul count or your soul meter when you trigger an SP3 to constantly deplete. Does kind of make it a headache, so I would recommend against it, but still doable with. Next up is Guardian, who at max SIG has access to up to about 80% bleed resistance. Additionally, he does have access to a relatively SP3 rotation into an SP2 burst and the fight, so you don't have to worry about recoil. The biggest thing here is that you do lose out on the SP1, SP2 rotation, which is a shorter fight rotation for Guardian, so unless you're committed to a longer fight with that SP3 playstyle, you are going to be suffering from recoil, but he does have access to the SP3 playstyle to begin with. Next up is Magneto Marvel Now, or White Magneto, just immune. After that, Old Man Logan, who has access to 95% bleed resistance, weird amount. He has a pseudo-permanent heal, which helps you really mitigate recoil / the poison if managed properly. I think the biggest thing that keeps Old Man Logan from going up higher is probably that he's not completely poison immune, because while it really helps mitigate the mastery, it doesn't really help mitigate any kind of node or fight mechanic if you're trying to deal with a specific champion. Sorry, I'm playing with the spreadsheet on my OBS. Next up is Korg. Korg is probably one of the best defenders, or at least one of the most consistently frustrating defenders, due to forcing specific mechanics or counters from the opposing players. Given his aggressive special usage, recoil actually hurts his defense a lot, but you could still use him with them. And if you're using him as an attacker, you're definitely going to want him because his damage is kind of in the pits. That's one of the few things he really, really needs. But when he's used as a defender, it's often on some kind of node that's boosting up his damage, making him more frustrating, like Aggression Prowess at the moment. So in that situation, recoil makes him a lot easier to handle. And you didn't really need it for the damage because he's already hitting really hard because of Aggression Prowess. Next up is Tyrax. Tyrax is better as a defender, but he is full bleed immune, and his specials cause him to not be able to launch specials until his power depletes, so recoil punishment is not as frequent. I do personally think Tyrax is better with recoil because of this, just because you get a lot more damage from him, making him a little bit more of a threat, and you're not suffering from recoil too often because he has that anti-recoil mechanic as a defender. Additionally, if he's high sigged, he starts with a lot of power, up to 2 bars of power, meaning that there's a longer period of time before he's even generating power to begin with, before he can throw a special and then suffer from recoil. So there's not as much recoil punishment here as the defender, so I would say he's probably better just having the extra damage threat. Next up is Rogue. She has 65% reduced debuff duration. This does also apply to stuns, making her better as a defender, but her SP1 spam does allow free damage for a mitigated recoil heal. You essentially heal as much as recoil does to you at recoil 1. Not the world's greatest, but on something like a power shield node where your specials are doing more damage, you actually heal more than you recoil. So there are some use cases where Rogue really comes into play for safe, slow, but safe fight mechanics. Next up is Luke Cage. While bleed immune, his main thing is that he has a special one pseudo stun lock, and you do lose that as being an effective method with him because of recoil, so not as good with. And then finally Beast, who just honestly isn't good enough as a champion in general to deserve the yellow highlight, but in regards to the masteries, once awakened, you barely take any damage from having both of them active and 1 point coagulate. So if he as a champion gets maybe a little bit of boosting to his kit, some kind of utility, some kind of big damage increase, you might see a huge raise on this spreadsheet, but at the moment it's just kind of worth noting. Next up are the honorable mentions. I'll try to hammer through these pretty quickly. So first is the Nick Fury Deadpool synergy, where you shrug. It's usually the bleed if you're running both. It's always the bleed if you're running the both, but it's one or the other if you only have one active. For a free heal at the start of the fight, it's actually a 10% heal, or slightly reduced if you're running the poison and double edge and the poison is still active, so be mindful of that. It's not a full 10%, but it's still a pretty good heal at the start of the fight. Next is Magic, who fully mitigates recoil, because the limbo that you proc when you throw a special, even unawakened, is long enough to mitigate recoil. Next up is Domino. At the start of the fight, she does have a chance to shrug the bleed, giving her some extra value, but also she does have really good access to a special 3 rotation, where her special 3 is very threatening, and you can just get away with that and don't have to worry about recoil. So you take a bit of damage at the start of the fight and then just punish them with SP3s for the rest of the fight. Next is Quake, where you never launch specials, so you never have to worry about recoil, and the extra damage from these masteries means less time quaking. Less time quaking means less, well, these are some of the longest fights you'll see is with Quake. Next up is Elsa Bloodstone, who is arguably better as a defender, but as a defender, if she's bleeding, you virtually force the opponent to bring a mutant or die to fun and interactive degen. But as an attacker, it's extra damage and 16 seconds of pseudo heal block, because as long as she's bleeding, the opponent is heal blocked, so that's a really good utility there as well. Next is Killmonger. It's a cheeky way to start with extra power. As a defender, this is good for a potential threat, especially with like the stubborn node right now. But as an attacker, it really hurts his SP2 rotation for indestructibility, especially since his damage is a little bit less than like the average champion. Oh, actually, maybe it's just about average, but his lower damage output in general means you're throwing more specials, which means recoil's coming up more often. So it does really, really hurt that, especially since Killmonger just gets a lot of value out of his SP2. But if you are playing safe and you're baiting specials properly and you're not relying on the indestructibility, you can do a special 3 rotation with Killmonger and mitigate recoil completely that way. Next is Captain America Infinity War. He can use a special 3 rotation, but honestly, his high damage output, his high perfect block / block percentage means that being low health isn't as risky as it is with other champions, and chaining a heavy into an SP2 can hit crazy hard and just end fights very quickly, to the point where you don't have to worry too much about recoil, even in things like war. Next up is Archangel. He doesn't need his specials because his neurotoxins is really like the core of his kit. Now the specials really help with this, but you don't need them, so Archangel does make the list for that reason. Next is Havoc, where recoil can hurt if you're trying to play Havoc optimally, because you do want to throw like a special 1 or maybe throw special 2s with Havoc every once in a while, but he has a very strong SP3 playstyle where you never have to worry about recoil, and that extra 60% damage is pretty free, you know what I'm saying? Next are Sabretooth and Deadpool X-Force, who I really only have here because they're beast synergies with Omega Red, and it's just such a good synergy for Omega Red that I felt like they needed to be on this list. There are other values to the champions, but that's the reason I have them on the honorable mention. Wolverine, Guillotine, Angela, and Scarlet Witch all have healing capabilities which are worth acknowledging, but they're not like so incredibly strong that they mitigate the masteries completely and entirely. Wolverine with some synergies might, Guillotine with some damage boosts might, and Angela in very long fights can, and Scarlet Witch with RNG. So for that reason, kind of the debatability on these 4, they're just in honorable mentions, but it is potential, especially in longer fights. Finally, I'm going to go over the math. So I'm sure a lot of you don't care, but for those of you who do, there's a timestamp here. And the way I have this out is the top table here is the percentage damage you take, and this accounts for max recovery. This accounts for the 30% reduced healing from Liquid Courage. If you're running Liquid Courage, notice that in one category it's max LC, in one category it's max double edge, and in the other category it's both. So I'm accounting for that 30% reduced healing in the first and third category here. And then the second table down here, this is if I converted that percentage health that you take as damage into quantity of seconds you survive, and then here I base it on masteries. Willpower 1 and 3, coagulate 1, 2, and 3, coagulate 1, willpower 1, coagulate 3, willpower 3, to kind of give an idea of how I decided on my mastery setup and why I recommend 3 willpower, 1 coagulate in the long run, but 1 point willpower, 1 coagulate in the short term. So that said, if you're running max liquid courage and you're not running any masteries, no willpower or coagulate or anything, it's 0.6% of your health per second. At 1 point willpower, that goes all the way down to 0.1975% per second, and at 3 points in willpower, it goes all the way down to 0.0365% per second. Just to kind of give you perspective. As far as max double edge, this is really where the comparison comes into play. At none, it's 1.25% per second of health that you're losing. 1.25% health per second that you're losing as long as double edge is active. It's a lot of health per second. Well, 1 point in willpower turns that to 0.675. Compare that to 1 point in coagulate, which turns it down to 1.125. So with that in mind, it's very easy to tell that 1 point in willpower is worth way more than 1 point in coagulate. But note that 2 points in willpower only brings it down from 0.675 to 0.445. And that's where you can draw the comparison that maybe 1 point in coagulate is worth more than 2 points in willpower. Like 1 point willpower, 1 point coagulate. And the reason I say maybe it's worth is it depends on if you're using champions like Omega Red. If you're using champions like Magneto Red, these champions who gain that extra benefit from having the bleed active and would have access to full healing if you had that 1 point in coagulate, something to consider. And for that reason, a lot of times I recommend 1 in 1 first. That's where I get here. The max recovery for 1 point willpower, 1 point coagulate is 0.55. Compare that to 2 points in coagulate, which is 1%. So that's almost half the amount of damage you're taking for the same quantity of points. Well, technically, it would be 1 point willpower, 2 points coagulate. But even better, compare the 3 point investment into willpower 3, which is 0.445, to the 2 point investment in willpower 1, coagulate 1, and you can see here that it's pretty comparable. It's not quite the same, but it's pretty comparable, and that's where I draw the comparison, saying that because of the champion usage on the spreadsheet, you're better off taking 1 in 1 in the long term, and then investing in an Omega Red or a Magneto Red or an Old Man Logan, etc. down the line. Additionally, if you're running both, here you can see 3 points in willpower is 0.723, and it's 0.92 for 1 in 1. So you are looking at like a 22% increase or so in damage over time, but that's just while both are active. And I would make the argument that, again, it's worth the added value. I think what really, really makes it easy to see is that when you're running only Liquid Courage, because a lot of people, if you're trying to run these masteries, you only run half. And I think Liquid Courage is the most common to start with because it's the most easily mitigated with willpower, is you have 167 seconds of fight time before your champion just dies. But if you take 1 point in willpower, you now have 506 seconds worth of fight time before your champion dies. And if you take 3 points in willpower, it's 2,739 seconds. That's more than 5 times as much value just by going up to 3 points in willpower. So as far as Liquid Courage is concerned, you really want 3 points, especially for endgame content. 1 point, 500 seconds is still really, really long. And in shorter term content, or if you're running poison immune rosters, you really only need the 1 point to help mitigate in the situations where you're not running a poison immune champion and you're not using them as often. And proper, suicide or attrition mastery friendly champions as taxis can really, really help. And then as far as double edge, same concept here. 80 seconds if or essentially 5 fights. 5 fights. Why do I keep saying that? 6 fights? 6 or 7 fights. You know what? My brain hurts at this point. Anyways, 80 seconds before 5 fights. 80 seconds of double edge will kill your champion completely without any kind of mitigation. This is 5 fights. 4 fights? Gosh, I don't care anymore. But you can see here it goes up to 148 at willpower 1 and 224 at willpower 3. Comparing this to the Liquid Courage, you're not getting nearly as high of a multiplied increase here, but do keep in mind that double edge isn't active the whole fight like Liquid Courage is, but especially in a lot of the shorter fights, the 16 seconds of double edge is pretty comparable to the amount of time you're going to have the poison ticking away at your health. So double edge is a lot more lethal in regards, especially in multiple fight or long quest chains usage. And you can see here that 1 point in coagulate only takes it from 80 seconds to 88.8, so you only get 9 or so second added instead of the 68 seconds you would get from the 1 point in willpower. And even at coagulate 3, you're only getting an additional 34 seconds. It's just really not a lot of gain. But here at willpower 1, coagulate 1, it's 181 seconds, and you can get all the way up to 1,428 seconds if you're running 3 and 3, but you really never need to run 3 and 3. Comparatively here, if you're running both masteries, you only have 54.8 seconds with no mitigation. 1 point in willpower brings you up to 95 seconds, and 1 point in willpower, 1 point in coagulate brings you up to 108, and you can almost, not quite, but almost triple that value by taking 3 and 3, or what I generally recommend is 3 willpower, 1 coagulate. Not my best math breakdown, but my brain just doesn't want to cooperate with me, and this has been a long recording, so I'm just going to take it. If something's confusing or I didn't explain something properly, I apologize. Feel free to ask me in the comments, and I'll do my best to explain when my head's a little more clear. That said, that's the spreadsheet. Let me know if you feel like I missed something. Let me know if you feel or have any questions about champions and their placement. But as always, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll talk to y'all later.